By day, I'm a school teacher, and I'm going to be talking to you tonight about the difficult birth and strange afterlife of a little-known canal, New York State's canal country. But it's not that canal, although it is related to it. To start with the history of canals, just generally, I would say that in a world like colonial America, where water transport is the only economic form of transport, civilization is going to follow rivers. However, rivers not always ideal or reliable transportation routes, and universally, of course, they are one way. It's a lot cheaper to go down a river than it is to go up a river. We had a booming business here, as I'm sure, all across the country in arcs, where farmers would knock together lumber into a large floating raft and wait for the spring floods and hope to make it all the way down to some sort of conurbation where they could break them apart and sell them and then walk back. So rivers not ideal, at least for one direction. The idea behind building canals is to link watersheds, link one watershed to the other, and allow you to go, well, sort of short circuit what might be a long trip. So you could be only, 60 miles by land away from another watershed, but if you wanted to get there via boat, it could be thousands of miles to get there. So, with all that said, I think it goes without saying, or is relatively easy to understand why the Erie Canal was such an important link between watersheds, right? On the one hand, you've got 4,500 odd miles of Great Lake coastline, plus all the rivers that drain into it. And on the other hand, you've got the Hudson River leading to New York City, which would very quickly, after the construction of the Erie Canal, turn into the nation's leading trade center, surpassing Boston and Philadelphia and all the southern cities. And I think simply on the basis of the access to all of that hinterland. Now, the important thing, I guess, to note about that Erie Canal, and not here to talk about the Erie Canal, though I got to start out there, is that without that canal, it's not entirely clear that the American, West at that time, the Transmontane West, the West on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, would have been a part of the North in the Civil War, just to pick a historical event at random. The Mississippi River would have linked it pretty tightly into the South. And, the math changes on that event pretty substantially. So it's not unreasonable to say that the Erie Canal was not simply another success, as did James Rubin. It was an enormous, astounding, and almost unbelievable success. The Erie Canal is kind of a big deal. It's going to reshape the geography of America in a way that is really pretty hard to overstate. It's also going to make a lot of people a lot of money, in the Midwest as well. But it's going to make a lot of people in New York a lot of money. And from the moment it opens, everybody wants a piece of that seemingly magic of canal development. It seemed almost as though if you just built a canal to it, then you too could have a similar development experience. So, unsurprisingly, imitators are going to abound. And the moment the Erie opens in 1825, and it's making money before that, by the way, the moment it opens, there's already several canals in consideration. So the map here, the schematic here, is of the Erie and Wabash Canal that's going to go, well, from the Lake Erie to the Wabash. There's also the Ohio and Erie. There's the longest, no, the Erie and Wabash, excuse me, is the longest canal in the world at the time of its construction. It's 497 miles long. People are going to build canals literally everywhere, each one of them hoping to recreate what the Erie did. But obviously, that's going to not work out so well. Most of these canals are going to fail relatively quickly. Counterintuitively, though, New York State wasn't an exception. New York is going to double down on canal construction, even though they had built the Erie, right? They wanted to maintain that sort of cutting edge in canal technology. And they saw these imitators in, neighboring states like Pennsylvania and Ohio. They saw these imitators as real threats to their hegemony and to the success of New York City in the Erie Canal system, which led to the building of branch canals. So, and this is in part a little bit of hubris, a little bit of bravado on the part of New York State. They're going to want to be the leader in canal construction here, but it's also very clearly a result of communities across the state who were not served by the Erie agitating for some of this canal stuff. Really, fundamentally, people saw this as magic. What the Erie had done to 360 or 363 miles of shoreline, turning basically worthless farmland into some of the hottest real estate in the country, I had a sort of aura of magic, and everybody wanted some. So all across New York, no matter if they lived on top of a mountain or not, people are going to want the same thing done for them, and that's not going to go very well. I hope I'm not spoiling my talk by saying that, but New York State will fall for it as well, right? Politically, it's a good idea. There's this huge amount of make work. There's a huge amount of money to be made on building these things. But also there's that very real perception that it's quite possible that you could get a winner and this canal could change everything for you. So eventually New York State would be girdled by canals, linking all of the state's major drainages into the Erie Canal. The most technologically ambitious of these branch canals, however, was the one that I'm interested in. It's the Genessee Valley Canal. So here's a map of the New York State Canal System, and I'm afraid I'm not smart enough to get a pointer. So you'll have to start with me here in Albany. I'm pointing at it. I don't know if you guys can see it. And the Erie Canal will follow the Mohawk Valley. This is the only gap in the Appalachian Mountains between, well, the Atlantic Ocean and Georgia that is reasonable to build a canal through. So this relatively low relief gap is where the Erie Canal will squirt through, and then it'll ride the Lake Ontario lowlands all the way out to Lake Erie. Here, this is the Genesee Valley Canal. It's going to start in Rochester, New York, and it's going to wend its way all the way down here to the town of Olean, New York. But the Black River Canal was certainly a big deal. The Chemung Canal, also all these again linking major drainages in New York State into this Erie Canal, as did the Champlain Canal, which went up to Lake Champlain and thence all the way up to the St. Lawrence River. Just before I move on, and again, my topic is the Genesee, I just want to point out that this is not a canal system in any meaningful sense. From the moment we complete the Erie Canal in 1825, people recognize that it's underbuilt and it needs to be enlarged. So they'll increase the size of the locks, they'll increase the breadth of the canal, they'll add double locks to allow more throughput of canal boats. Most of the branch canals are built to the size standard of the original Erie. So it's not a canal system, and everybody kind of built their own canal. So it isn't a national canal system either, although why it would be, since there are lakes in between the Erie and Wabash, for example. The dream of the Genesee Valley Canal, anyways, is to link the Ohio River Valley and point south to the Erie Canal, and of course from there into New York City. This, everybody hoped at the time, would kind of cut Pennsylvania out of the produce of their western mines and farms and send all of that material, and of course at a much reduced price from transporting it overland, send all of that material into New York State and into New York State cities. And some people even hoped that points further down the Ohio River, or pardon me, further down, this is the Allegheny River that runs into Pittsburgh here. People hoped that further down the Ohio would also choose to send their goods upriver to the Erie system rather than downriver to New Orleans, especially with the advent of steam shipping. Some of these hopes were a little bit overblown. This ran in a New York City newspaper and was reprinted in Rochester, New York, where you could expect them to regard a quote like this as fairly scriptural, right? So when we consider it in a more national and large sense and recognize it, in it a canal by which the city of New York will be united with the immense regions of the country through which flow the navigable rivers of the great and fruitful West. It swells from the minor importance of a branch canal to a rivalry with the greatest river on the face of the habitable globe. Now, truly, early 19th century newspapers were not known for their understatement, but the bold is in the original. And this, there, hopes ran high, I guess, for this canal, really extending the reach of New York State and extending the reach of the Erie outside of the state and doing sort of the same magic that the Erie Canal did. It was a bold vision because it turns out that between Rochester on the Erie Canal and the Allegheny River was a not inconsiderable mountain range. And sending a boat up a mountain is going to present some technological difficulties that are going to be overcome, but only barely. In reality, even the undertaking of the survey is a staggering amount of work. The remit to survey the route of the canal will fall to a gentleman by the name of Frederick C. Mills. And if anybody knows anything about Frederick C. Mills, I would be immensely grateful for it. His biography is pretty sparse. He was a self-taught engineer. His education consisted of a free school in Saratoga, New York, but you never know who these things reach. I'd be happy for any information on him. Seems like he worked for the state in the canal board for his entire life. Anyways, he was given money and authority to survey a route for the Genessee Valley Canal. He actually looked at 3 routes. Of them, he chose the route that would follow the Genesee River almost all the way to Olean. It looks like on a map, a contemporary map, it looks like it's a pretty short jaunt over a hill to go from the Genesee River into creeks that drain into the Allegheny River. So it looked like the most practical. And as he got on the ground, it seemed like it was the most practical. I just want to showcase the survey itself for a moment. To survey the canal's 107 miles, Mills is going to not only mark this path of the canal out and check hillsides and have to do, just a staggering number of detailed altitude readings to make sure that the canal is more or less level. He's also going to have to dig or have dug holes down to the presumed canal bed depth, right? So once he figures out the altitude of the existing ground, he's going to dig a pit down to where the floor of the canal will eventually be. And all of that's going to be recorded in these detailed drawings. So this is a sketch from one of his site books that he wrote on the survey. It's in the New York State Archives. And it gives you an idea of the quantity of like math and calculation and geometry he's doing to make an estimate of how much material is going to have to be moved by the contractors when each mile of this canal was bid out as a section. Anyways, the survey is done by 1836 and construction begins at the northern terminus in Rochester, New York in 1837. Engineering drawings in the 19th century were pretty. Each one of these sketches represents the position of the canal and the potential prism of the canal 66 feet apart, so one chain apart. Again, it's 107 miles long. He made a lot of sketches. I assume he went through an awful lot of ink. It's a schematic of the Genessee Valley Canal. So if you're at all familiar with the Finger Lakes region of New York State, maybe some of these town names will seem familiar to you. Rochester is on Lake Ontario, and Olean down here is on the Allegheny River, which, as I mentioned earlier, is going to meet up with the Ohio at Pittsburgh. The GVC, Genesee Valley Canal, is effectively 2 canals, at least technically 2 canals. And I mean that in the technical problems confronted by people are different on the northern section from Rochester to Shaker Settlement or Saunier. Saunier is the current name of this town. It was originally called Shaker Settlement because the Shakers, as in the religious group, moved from near Rochester when the Erie Canal came through. They just could not stand and or abide by the worldliness of the canalmen and all the money and swearing and drinking that what came along with them. So they sold out and moved to the middle of nowhere, and New York State then put a canal right through their town. They actually ended up suing in New York State and winning that case. So they moved on, and the state took over that. And I've heard, but I've never confirmed it, that Saunier, the name, is actually a contraction for the state of New York Epileptic Academy. Anyways, from Rochester to Saunier, the Genesee River flows through a really broad valley, deep tilth soil. And that's pretty much where most of the Erie Canal passed through as well. So the engineering problems or issues with the northern portion of the canal were relatively well known, easy to overcome, and understood by nearly everybody. After Shakers, though, the canal is going to abandon the Genesee River for a bit and head up a narrow creek called the Keshequa Creek. And boy, howdy, do the problems begin there. Here at Messenger's Hollow on the map, and again, I can't tell if you guys can see the pointer or not. The canal's going to have to cut through a dirt plug. They're going to have to pass through a very narrow gorge with precipitous walls, 300 feet deep or so. And all of this, in addition, all these engineering problems of fitting a canal into a narrow river valley, in addition to the fact that the canal is going to be the highest one in the world. The Genessee Valley Canal is going to climb to a 1,500-foot summit. That's about 970 feet above the city of Rochester. It's got 1,000 feet of lift. That is a substantial elevation climb for a canal to make. The highest canal after the Genesee Valley is the King Ludwig Canal in Germany and the Canal du Midi in France, both of which rise 600 feet. So beating those European canals by half again. This was a technological challenge, and it was really something of a vanity project for New York State, attempting to sort of brag about their canal know-how. Here's a profile of the canal, and you can see, again, here we are at the Erie Canal in the hopefully named Ohio Basin in Rochester, New York, and then relatively easy rise to Shakers, and then boy howdy does it just shoot right up. And that 970 feet of elevation is going to be achieved through locks. I didn't really spend a lot of time talking about locks. There are 115 locks on the main line of the Genesee Valley Canal. There's a couple on the 11-mile spur that ran over to Dansville as well. This is a pretty intensely locked canal. There's more than one lock per mile of the Genesee Valley Canal. So the problems are going to be staggering and difficult to really solve with the technology that Mills had at his disposal. But he added to his problems to some extent, or at least the state did, by allowing or calling for a variety of really interesting flourishes. So at one point where the canal passes through a gorge, there's a rock outcropping that pinches very close to the wall of the gorge. And Mills' design called for a 1,600-foot tunnel through a rock outcropping. So the canal would pass through a tunnel through a mountain. On the other hand, there's that Messenger's Hollow I mentioned. That's a earthen berm. It's mostly glacial till that was dumped there. In order to pass the canal through that, is going to necessitate the removal of 443,000 cubic yards of material, all by shovel and cart. I checked the math on that. I'm fairly certain that that's about 29,000 9-ton dump truck loads, which is a substantial number of 9-ton dump truck loads. It looks like a valley when you go check it out today. And of course, there's this problem of water, right? Canals, well, they do require water. They lose a surprising amount of water just through evaporation. But also every time one of those 117 locks cycle, or 115 locks cycle, they're going to move something like 15,000 cubic feet of water downstream. And that that water all has to come from somewhere, and unless you're going to pump it, which in the 1830s you're not, you're going to have that impounded somewhere. So in order to provide water for this canal at the summit level, which again is at 1,500 feet of elevation, they're going to build the largest earthen dam then in the world at a town called Cuba, New York, across Oil Creek. That dam's still there. It is still a very large earthen dam. I had a chance to poke around at it while I was doing research for this paper. What an interesting place to live downstream from that. It was raised 3 times. They added 13 feet to that canal, or pardon me, to that dam, which would give me the warm and fuzzies. But then again, I guess it stood since the 1850s, so it's probably fine. There was a global economic collapse in 1837, which is going to substantially put a crimp on the construction of the canal. This is the tunnel as it looked in 1962, I believe. You can't get into it now. The New York State Parks Department has very thoroughly prevented any human-sized entry, and that's probably for the best. It's turned into something of a bat cave, and we certainly don't need to mess around with any more bat-borne diseases. But you can see that the tunnel is not, well, a tunnel. It looks more like kind of a mess. Once the global economic collapse hits, the Panic of 1837 hits, New York State continues building canal up until about 1842, when a change in politics is going to change really our priorities as a state. And the canal will actually sit abandoned for 6 years. When they come back to work on it in 1848, they'd found that the tunnel had largely collapsed at one end and filled with silt at the other end. And yeah, they just abandoned it and decided to pin the canal to the wall of the gorge in a wooden tub, which you can kind of see in this picture. And again, I hope you guys can see me. Oh, maybe that'll work. Oh, hey, look at that. Okay, so if you couldn't see the pointer before, hopefully you can see it now. This right here is the tunnel opening. The tunnel runs from the foreground of the picture to the background of the picture, but they decided to dig one portal in and then work 2 cutting faces out either end of this rock outcropping. And then this is the spoil pile of the material that they just dumped off the side there. So this is after they'd abandoned the tunnel, and now you can see the canal running here. As we get down here, you can see the wooden tubs in which the canal ran. This section is particularly awful in that it's across a gorge that had formerly widened into the Genessee River here. So it's just full of loose till that's sliding down into the gorge. So the tubs also slid down with it. Usually that happened in the off season when the canal was drained. This was just a major problem to rebuild it in the spring. In the background, you can see what kills the Genessee Valley Canal, and that's a very high wooden trestle railroad bridge, and the railroad will be the agent of death of this operation. Here's a cross section of the dam. This is at Oil Creek in Cuba. It's interesting, the construction method. This culvert, I think, is still down there, although they have changed the outflow pipes, but you can still crawl around in there if you're of a mind to. Some of the stonework in there, I believe, is original to the canal, although the outflow valves have been modernized a little bit. But the whole thing was built with slabs of clay that were cut, like 3 foot by 3 foot by 1 foot slabs, and then stacked one on top of the other like bricks and wet down to mortar them. So an interesting structure. Should you ever find yourself in Cuba, New York, go check it out. The canal, as a result of the collapse of the world economy, or at least the Atlantic economy, and the change in New York State politics, won't be finished until 1861. And there was other things going on in 1861 in America that somewhat muted the celebration. But it wouldn't have gotten one anyways. It opened to almost instant obsolescence. The Erie Railroad, which is going to run east-west across the southern tier of New York, was completed in 1851. And Pennsylvania, and this probably will surprise nobody, chose not to improve the Allegheny River to Olean to allow the easy transport of goods to New York City, but rather chose to funnel goods from Pittsburgh and their western mines and farms into their own canal system and into Philadelphia. Go figure. That lack of public spiritedness on their part, the Genesee Valley Canal never really carried much other than lumber from the communities along its length. There was surprisingly little protest when the canal was abandoned in 1878. So this is a extant lock. So Daniel mentioned that there's a lot of structures still along the canal, and there are. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to the strange afterlife part. Right about now. New York State is going to attempt to sell the canal property, but they will include a caveat or a codicil in the contract that whoever buys it has to use it as a canal, which obviously was kind of a non-starter in that if you could make money with this as a canal, why didn't New York State make money with this as a canal? So nobody bought until they removed that and instead replaced it with a different rider that whoever bought the property had to replace it with a railroad within 2 years. That went fast, and the Genessee Valley Canal Railroad was completed in 1881. It follows more or less the canal's path, and in some places they just filled the canal prism in with ballast and laid track on it. In some places the trains run on the towpath, and in other places the track diverges substantially from the path of the canal. So what we have is really an interesting overlayered archaeological remain for this canal, wherein you have the original canal and then you have the railroad, which kind of followed the canal. And now, and I'll talk about this in a second, there's a greenway that runs along the path of kind of the canal and kind of the railroad. But none of them are the exact path of the canal, although the greenway does hit a lot of the high points. But back to the railroad, it didn't last very long. It almost immediately sold out to what would become the Pennsylvania Railroad system, which is, kind of ironic, right? The Pennsylvania Railroad system becomes the beneficiary of the tremendous amounts of work that New York State paid for to level a canal right away. But hey, I guess turnabout's fair play. So that turns into a spur on the Pennsylvania system. It's the Rochester branch, and that will run all the way down to Olean. And they'll run that until 1961. I think they stopped running passengers either during the Depression or right after World War II. But it sticks around as a freight line until 61. And then they abandoned that in turn. At which point it becomes the Genesee Valley Greenway. Well, 30 years later, the local power company purchased it, perhaps thinking that they were going to run some high tension lines over that right away. I don't know what their thinking was. That was beyond the scope of my research. But by 1991, the New York State Parks Department owned a substantial portion of it, and a group of citizens along its length were agitating to install some sort of trail or path along it. So the Genesee Valley Greenway was born. They're going to open sections of it in 92. And by the time we get to 2000, the the Greenway stretches from Rochester to Cuba, not all the way to Olean. So it doesn't actually join the Allegheny River. And it's handed back over to the state as a park in 2000. And again, I guess this is the point I want to make about this, and sort of to how Daniel opened me up here as I wrap it up. Although the Greenway generally follows the path of the railroad, and although the railroad generally followed the path of the canal, and although there are remains of both railroad and canal along the path, the Greenway does not exactly follow the canal. So should you ever find yourself in central New York and looking for a nice walk, you can walk along the Greenway and you'll find some things like this lock at Wadsworth Crossing, just outside of Geneseo. But you can't be sure that you're on the canal. And one of the things I would love to see, although I'm not necessarily nominating myself for the job, is to see the history of this canal and this railroad a little better interpreted along the Greenway. Greenway is very cool and lots of fun, but not particularly historical. So with that, thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to Daniel.